There are so many ways for a manga artist to convey information and feelings through panels on a page. A beautifully detailed 2-page spread, a wall of text, or even... That can't be right. Is that the right slide? Yes, we'll come back to it? Not bad, but it could use a little more fantasy. When Chainsaw Man came out, it was thoroughly lampooned on the internet, mostly but not only in Japan, for taking too many liberties with the source material and portraying it with a strong sense of cinematic realism. To some, the muted colors, filmic approach to cinematography, and naturalistic voice performances flew in the face of the cartoonish absurdity of the manga. So naturally, they bullied the director, Ryu Nakayama, mercilessly until he set his Twitter to private and left the studio to form his own. And he certainly made it easy for all of the most moe-brained internet mongrels who equate Akiba's style with the very concept of animation itself to misunderstand his intentions. Animation itself is not an expressive technique that can only be achieved by relying on such things. When it came time to make an animated version of Chainsaw Man, I looked for links to what I wanted to do, and since I myself love movies and Mr. Fujimoto also loves movies, I thought it would be interesting to incorporate the essence of the realistic and cinematic. No wonder the anime feels awfully off. The director himself hates anime. People who hate things famously devote their lives to creating more of the thing that they hate. Somebody call Mensa. As plenty of people have already said, there's obviously nothing wrong with an adaptation doing something different from the source material, and as we've seen in my series on Dungeon Meshi, what works well on the printed page sometimes needs to be altered to work just as well on the screen. But even beyond that, what these people are missing is that Nakayama is picking up on and magnifying an element that's already very important to all of Fujimoto's work, including Chainsaw Man. It's not just about the absurd, it's about the confluence of realism and absurdity, the contrast between expectations and reality, and it's about cinema in its own weird way. Sure, Denji makes a lot of absurd faces, and Fujimoto loves to play with timing in unexpected ways, but at its core, there's a simplicity and a cinematic realism to the way he often favors straightforward horizontal panels over more ostentatious layouts, in the realistic detail to his artwork, and even in those absurd expressions. I've always thought there's a filmic quality to the way he draws his characters. He doesn't seem to come at it from a symbolic perspective, thinking, okay, what expression would best represent this feeling, but instead imagining what it would look like if you literally filmed a real person acting out the scene, then paused the video on a random frame in the middle of a word. And because of that approach, you end up with these expressions that feel like weird snapshots from a video rather than something that you would normally see in a polished artwork. And it's that tinge of filmic realism that makes the absurdity stand out as much as it does. It's no wonder Nakayama references Fujimoto's love for film in that interview, because it's an influence that his work wears on its sleeve, or wears on its dust jacket, I guess. That can be seen in this scene where a domineering woman forces the protagonist to watch 6 movies in a row with her, and even more so in this scene where a domineering girl forces the protagonist to watch 9 movies in a row with her. This is Goodbye Eri, a surreal, heartbreaking, and touching 200-page ode to film and the creative process. And those of you who clicked on this video without reading the title or looking at the thumbnail will be surprised to find out it's what the video is about. And now that we're here, if by the end of the video you find that you enjoyed it, there's a little like button and a little subscribe button down there that you can use to express yourself, and it helps out the channel a bit. Thanks. Goodbye Eri is one of 2 one-shots that Fujimoto wrote between the end of Chainsaw Man Part 1 and the start of Part 2, the other one being Look Back, which was recently adapted into a presumably sensational movie. It hasn't come out in the States yet at the time I'm recording this. It's the only found footage comic book that I'm aware of, at least, and nowhere is his certified cinephile status more on display, to the point that I'm convinced that he at some point wanted to be a filmmaker before realizing he was too much of an antisocial freak to follow that exact career path. Very relatable. This book isn't just about movies. It is a movie. So many of these pages literally look like they could be a strip of film, with each panel as a new frame. My life a movie, more like my book, more like my book a movie. This is gonna be my last video. I'm giving up after this. Before we get into it, a content warning for suicide and a pinch of child abuse. Also, I'll stay spoiler-free as long as possible for those of you who care about that sort of thing, and I'll give a couple warnings when we get to points where I no longer can. Yuta Ito gets a smartphone for his birthday, and at the request of his terminally ill mother, he uses it to capture every moment of life with her and immortalize her in a homemade documentary that he would later screen in front of his entire school. But when it comes time to fulfill her final wish and capture the actual moment of her death, Yuta just can't bring himself to do it. He runs away from the hospital as his father calls his name, and... From this setup, you may be thinking, this sounds sad. I'm already sad enough. The planet's being destroyed, the government hates us, the animals are leaving, etc. And, well, yeah, it is sad. But it's also inspiring, funny, uplifting even, with its exploration of creativity as a tool to process the horrors of the world around us and film as immortality. Not to mention being packed with twists that recontextualize everything you've read up until that moment, and films within films that keep you guessing if what you're looking at is actually reality at any given moment. The first thing you'll notice is Fujimoto's rigid adherence to the simple format of just 4 horizontal panels per page to create frames of video that loosely mimic the shape of his smartphone recordings, aside from the occasional full-page spread to emphasize an important moment. While Yuta himself isn't on screen for very much of this opening film, Fujimoto uses motion blur as a window into his mind. The camera is an extension of him as a character. This panel is steady and intentionally framed, staged even. This one is at a Dutch angle but still steady, but when his mother asks him how he feels about the fact that she might die soon, the camera drifts uncontrollably to the side, blurring as it does. Just as Yuta shifts uncomfortably in his chair, and his mother's seemingly kind eyes and melancholy smile take on a much more unsettling air in the corner of the panel as she gazes into the middle distance. After his film gets a 0% on Rotten Tomatoes, and he's told by his classmates that he's despicable for portraying his mother's death like that, Yuta plans to jump off the roof of the same hospital that starred in the climax of his film. We watch him climb the stairs through a series of hurried, tilted, blurry panels that span across 4 pages, but at the last moment he's interrupted by a mysterious cinephile named Eri, who first asks him to give her the money that's in his wallet before recognizing him as the auteur director behind Dead Explosion Mother. She drags him to an abandoned building where she forces him to watch 9 movies in a row before confessing that while his film was amateurish and had several problems, she found it raw and real. She challenges him to make another movie for next year's cultural festival, one that will make all those losers bawl their eyes out. But to make a good movie, he has to study them. So from then on, the two watch a shitload of movies after school every day, and Eri quizzes Yuta on their narrative structure so as to sculpt him into an actually good filmmaker. But even after the conclusion of Dead Explosion Mother and Yuta's subsequent video suicide note, the book never abandons this pattern of 4 wide cinematic panels per page. This is in part because Yuta's idea for his next film was a semi-autobiographical retelling of this very story, just with Eri as a vampire, and Fujimoto never allows the reader to sit comfortably for too long in one version of reality, always making you question whether what you're reading is objective reality or just another piece of the film, but also because this whole thing is fundamentally a love letter to cinema, even if there are parts that take place outside of the world of Yuta's film, which is debatable. The line between life and film is blurred, just like the physical panels themselves, because in this story the two are one and the same. Yuta sees the world through his films, both literally and figuratively, and his mother lives on within them. A common thread in Fujimoto's work is his tendency to play with time through his paneling, which is often used for comedy, like showing a character peeing for just a very, very long time in his first serialized manga, Fire Punch, or the opposite, like this moment early in Chainsaw Man when Power empathizes with Denji and connects with him on a human level for the first time over the feeling of not being able to pet your furry little friend anymore, with 4 panels where you can practically see the little blood-powered water wheel turning in her head, but then right at the moment of emotional connection, she's suddenly gobbled up by the Bat Devil in the blink of an eye. But it goes beyond just comedy, like this moment near the start of Chainsaw Chainsaw Man Part 2 when Asa, elated to have finally made a real friend at her school, hears her new friend cheerfully admit to having murdered her neighbor the day before just for gambling at pachinko while also being on disability welfare. Across 5 almost identical panels and one massive detailed spread, Yuko's content, cheerful expression stays exactly the same while Asa registers what she just said, and the smile gradually fades from her face as she comes to terms with the fact that this new friendship will not be what she had hoped it would be. But nowhere is this intentional control of the passage of time stronger and more thematically relevant than in Goodbye Eri. Right from the start, you can feel the rhythm to the cuts, as if Fujimoto is acting more like a video editor than a writer. Starting from that same scene, a fast-paced montage shows Yuta with his family doing their best to live a normal life, cutting from one scene to the next with each individual panel, but then that rhythm will be interrupted by a slow moment that cuts through it all and shows the real effect that this is all having on Yuta. It's all very heavy, but there's still a sort of absurdist comedy to the way he interrupts his own pacing at the same time. Mom telling Yuta not to film her while she takes a shit, neighborhood cat, mom telling Yuta not to film her while she takes a bath, dad crying in the corner, then suddenly an entire page, 4 identical panels, Yuta filming his parents in the middle of the night, just in case his mother dies in her sleep. Dad saying Yuta doesn't have to film him, Yuta awarding Dad just 2 points for his cooking, Mom staring across a pond, toothbrushes, then another interruption. Yuta filming himself in the mirror, contemplating how he hasn't really processed this all. He's just been viewing it through his phone screen, all while his phone literally covers his eyes. Without any fancy layouts, panel shapes, overlap, staggering, or any of the other tricks that many artists use to liven up their storytelling, Fujimoto thinks like a filmmaker and uses that restriction to focus solely on one element, manipulating the passage of time to tell a story that's emotionally resonant. Like this scene where Eri comes over for dinner with his dad, and immediately after Yuta says his dad is a chatterbox, he's gonna talk your ear off, we're treated to 3 whole pages of him just slowly, methodically eating dinner in complete silence. Or finally, to return to the inciting incident of this video, the end of Yuta's second film. While the first movie purported to be about his mom, as Eri points out, he had been the most compelling character despite spending most of it behind the camera, so the second one is about this fictionalized version of Eri, but it also admits to being about Yuta. The final panels show his mother, himself, then darkness. 4 full pages of it before narration brings the film to a close. This is of course a representation of the dramatic black screen at the end of Yuta's movie within the story, but it also indicates a time jump in the book itself, working simultaneously to serve the story and the story within the story. An obvious difference between the printed page and moving pictures is that with a comic book, your brain controls the pace of the story. If you get to the end of a chapter, you can sit and digest it a bit before continuing, but you're also totally free to just dive right into the next one. But pacing is one of the most important things for an editor to think about, so just as he controls the pace of a scene by repeating or omitting panels, he literally forces you to experience this moment of silence as if you were watching a movie. Even if you're speed reading this thing, you're forced to physically turn the page twice while looking at nothing but black rectangles. Okay, up to this point, I've only tiptoed around the main themes so as not to reveal too much of the plot, and this next bit concerns plot elements from around the midpoint, and while they're central to the themes of the story, and one of which you can infer simply from the title of the book itself, some people may consider them spoilers, so if you're already sold and just want to go in blind, now would be the time to go read it for yourself, and come back to this video once you have, because I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. And also I need the watch time. I'll give one more warning towards the end, because, like I mentioned, twists on twists. Okay, in Goodbye Eri, film, even documentary film, is more than just a reproduction of reality. It creates reality. Shapes it. The two are one and the same. So when Yuta's father reveals that he filmed his wife's death in Yuta's absence, and we realize that what we saw in the first few pages was an idealized version of the truth, a memory of just the good parts, it becomes clear that far from the warm, kind version we saw on the screen, Yuta's mother was actually quite controlling, even abusive, and worse of all, a TV producer. The film to her was just a vanity project, a way for her to control the way she's seen and remembered, down to the littlest smallest detail, and her son just a tool to that end. But as much as she tells him that his recordings of neighborhood cats are pointless, as the filmmaker, this ultimately is Yuta's story, and even if Eri and his dad are the only ones who can see it, that reality shines through in the final product. It's a deeply personal film, not a reproduction of objective reality, but an authentic reflection of it, filtered through the lens of Yuta's mind, which in turn creates its own reality. It reminds his father of the good memories, grants his mother immortality, and gives Eri hope for a truly great film in the future. Despite its flaws and lack of polish, the authenticity connects with a small but passionate audience of two people. This is his memory, and the little bit of fantasy that he adds may seem downright disrespectful to almost everyone who watches it, but it's a piece of himself. For Yuta, life is film, and the little embellishments he adds are part of life itself. So when it turns out that, as the title suggests, Eri is also dying of some sort of unnamed terminal illness, she wants to see his story, but she also wants him to choose how she'll be remembered, just like he did with his mom. And when the film concludes, it once again turns out that Yuta's portrayal of her wasn't exactly accurate to reality either. Film is immortality, and film creates reality. This version of Eri is the real Eri in the minds of everyone who watched the film, just as it was the real Eri in the book itself, right up until this point. Which leads me to the ending explained portion of the video, and even more spoilers. You've been warned. Post-time jump, after obsessing for years over the feeling that something was still missing from his film, and even more tragedy for him to endure, this time the sudden deaths of his entire family in a car crash, Yuta records another video suicide note and heads to the old abandoned building with those same suspense-building point-of-view shots from his climb to the hospital roof at the beginning. But with a hardcore cyclical type vibe, he's shocked to find his film playing, and Eri there watching it, looking just the same as the day she prevented his first suicide attempt. She gets all metatextual, almost to the point of breaking the fourth wall, in explaining that what was missing from the film was that element of fantasy that Yuta always added, because unbeknownst to him, Eri actually is a vampire whose brain storage gets full every 200 years or so, causing her to essentially die and come back with a blank slate and no memory of her previous self. Film is immortality, not just for his mom and for Eri, but for Yuta as well, because he, at least this version of him from his childhood, will continue to live on in a very real way as Eri rewatches his movie, with each reincarnation to remind herself who she is. And with the revelation of what was missing, that little bit of fantasy shows itself again as he leaves the building. I've seen several people give their theories about this ending online, how the entire book is actually part of the film that he re-edited, even going as far as to explain the particulars of how the scene was filmed, whether with CGI, pre-recorded scenes, or young Yuta having his dad play the role of him as an adult. And I could discredit some of the particulars, like that if you put Yuta and his dad side by side, they don't actually look that similar. His dad clearly has some wrinkles that he doesn't have. While I don't disagree with the general theory here, and it certainly makes sense with everything we've seen before and the format of the book, I think it's ultimately beside the point. More important than any game theory style literal explanations is the concept that life imitates art, an overused phrase for sure, but one that's really relevant here. In Oscar Wilde's essay, The Decay of Lying, where he coined the phrase, he means it very literally. At present, people see fogs not because there are fogs, but because poets and painters have taught them the mysterious loveliness of such effects. There may have been fogs for centuries in London, I dare say there were, but no one saw them, and so we do not know anything about them. They did not exist till art had invented them. So how did Yuta create the illusion of an immortal vampire? Well, how did he pull off the hospital explosion in his original film as a kid? Personally, I prefer the explanation that he didn't create the illusion, and his artistic creation simply manifested into reality, just like he created the version of his mother we see in the first few pages. But ultimately, the answer is that it doesn't really matter, because it's about the act of creation and bringing a new truth into the world. And likewise, in the final page, the climax of Yuta's childhood film becomes reality, and whether the ultimate creator of the story is Yuta or simply Tatsuki Fujimoto himself, the end result is the same. Life imitates art, film creates reality. Not bad, but it could use a little more fantasy. thank you for watching, especially if you were originally here for the Dungeon Meshi series but stuck around anyway. And a special thank you to my supporters on Patreon, some of whom got to access this video a few days early and without ads. Katie L, Siege Weasel, Retro Hime, Serial Isle, Leia Pico, Nutaf, Patrick Davison, Arborix, Lisette MT, Jun, Dr. Yola McSwag, Grav G, Squid Goo, Achu, Austin and Shoji, Julian Francisco, Joe, Daku, Alex Cervantes, and Jen Stalins, as well as all the other names you're seeing on the screen right now. I'll see you next time.